Neurotic Literature by James Lark. This story, The New Member. Jeff Clayton awoke from uneasy dreams to discover that he had a different penis. Later he would tell people that he knew straight away, without looking. The truth is, everything felt strange when he woke up. At first he assumed it was just the unfamiliar hospital smell, the crisp, white sheets hugging him to the bed a little too tightly, the blue curtains surrounding him as if he was trapped on a tiny white island in a vast ocean. He wriggled in the bed, trying to throw off the claustrophobic constraint of the sheets. He blinked. Things were beginning to come into focus, but he still felt that something was wrong. Experimentally, he touched his left cheek. His fingers met with smooth skin. He stroked it once, enjoying the new experience. That had changed then. His operation had been a success. A single night in a hospital bed, and his non-malignant mole was gone forever. His mole had been non-malignant only in the strictest medical sense. Aside from the fact that it wasn't actually cancerous, it had been a truly vicious little bastard, from the names it had earned him at school to the vindictive way it interfered with shaving. Good riddance to the bloody thing. There would be no more standing in front of the mirror for minutes on end, pulling his face first one way then another to shave around it. No more standing with toilet paper pressed to his face, waiting for it to stop bleeding when he nicked it. No more watching people's eyes awkwardly drift to the side, then snap back to make conspicuous eye contact during conversations. Yet Jeff now realized that he felt strangely vulnerable. Could the loss of a single mole do that? He stroked his cheek again. No, that didn't feel wrong at all. His face felt free and unblemished. He should have been smiling, but something in his gut continued to protest that all was not as it should be. He gently massaged his arms and ribs, as if checking for breakages. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, though the feeling in his limbs was reassuring. But as he reached for his legs in the same way, his hand brushed against his penis, and a shock resonated through his whole body. The sensation had been foreign and frightening. He lay as still as possible, taking quick, shallow breaths, and realized that he was shaking. What was it that had alarmed him? He had only touched his penis. He'd been doing that for the last 35 years. He moved his hand back to his genitals and let it rest there. His heart started to beat faster, a thudding, panicked crescendo. It was only his hand, he told himself, his hand on his penis. What was there to be afraid of? He forced himself to hold it there, trying to get used to it, but he felt as though he was being touched by an unwelcome second party. No, not quite that. He felt as though he was touching the second party himself, touching another man's penis. He withdrew his hand quickly, trembling and breathing heavily. He felt violated, as if he had been tricked into a homosexual act, which was absurd, of course. He would never, not even if he was tricked, would he? But anyway, he hadn't. The whole thing was absurd, for goodness sake. He had never had a problem touching his penis before. He had never had a problem with other people touching his penis, come to that. There must be something wrong with it. He hastily untucked the precisely arranged sheets and pushed them to the bottom of the bed, then anxiously rolled up his hospital gown as far as his waist. Nestling in a mass of troubled pubic hair, his shriveled appendage looked like an alien object submerged in thick foliage. He barely recognized it. Or rather, he decided as he stared in growing disbelief, he didn't recognize it. Well, he recognized it as a penis. Just not his penis. He held his breath, listening for any other human activity beyond the curtains around his bed. He certainly had no desire to be caught with his manhood exposed by some trainee nurse, except perhaps the attractive young trainee nurse who had helped administer the general anaesthetic. He smiled to himself, momentarily caught up in this fantasy, but was jolted back to reality by the thought that she would be looking at another man's penis. Another man's penis. What did he mean? How could it possibly be another man's penis? He sat up to get a better view. No, it had been no mistake. It was definitely not his own penis. It wasn't substantially different to the one he was used to. A little bigger, maybe, not that he'd had a small penis before, and the pubic hair was a slightly lighter colour with a hint of red. He shuddered. There was nothing actually wrong with it. It simply wasn't his. Unable to move his horrified gaze from the stranger between his legs, he frantically wondered how his penis could possibly have been replaced with a different one. The events prior to the operation darted through his mind. Had there been some kind of misunderstanding when he had checked into the hospital? But what sort of misunderstanding would lead a surgeon to give him a different penis instead of removing a non-malignant mole? He wildly thought through possible links between the two actions, only there were none. He was assuming it was surgical. How else could this have happened? Without daring to touch it, Jeff studied the area around his groin for anything to show how the substitution had been achieved. He could see no marks, no scars, nothing to suggest that it wasn't exactly the same penis that had always resided there. Maybe, he thought, the marks left by whatever surgery had taken place were concealed by the pubic hair. As if putting his hands into raw sewage, he warily parted the unfamiliar copper-tinged thicket, but, sickened by the colour and the texture, he took his hands away again. The more he looked at the thing, the more it repulsed him. Feeling the bile rising in his throat, he hastily rearranged the gown to conceal it. For a moment he thought he would actually throw up, but with the anomaly hidden, he found he was breathing more calmly. He closed his eyes and inhaled a deep breath of air, then exhaled as slowly as his body would allow. His agitated thoughts were slowing down, arranging themselves more rationally. As he got a grip on himself and on reality, he began to wonder if he'd allowed himself to become scared by an infantile trick of his mind. However different it had looked moments ago, it clearly couldn't be somebody else's penis. It occurred to him that it had been a long time, years even, since he had actually examined his genitals. Gone were his adolescent days of standing naked in front of his parents' full-length mirror, inspecting himself critically, and worrying about the way it looked, or eventually concluding that it looked pretty good, and standing in front of the mirror simply to admire himself. In fact, he had continued this pastime long after adolescence, but he hadn't done it recently. And penises did change, after all. That was a fact of life. Not having looked at it with any interest for such a long time, it didn't seem unlikely that, in this unfamiliar setting, he had been alarmed by a change he simply hadn't noticed before. He recalled a similar feeling of shock when, at 11 years old, developments he had been fully briefed on but totally unprepared for had started with alarmingly dramatic speed. Maybe it was even a side effect. Could anaesthetic cause a temporary change in genitalia? As long as it was temporary, he thought. There'd be hell to pay if they'd caused it to change shape without his permission. There ought to be a form to fill in, like when you agreed to take drugs that gave you nightmares and rashes. They couldn't assume that people would tolerate the reshaping of their private parts without warning. His resentment died away as quickly as it had boiled up. He was being irrational. His penis probably hadn't even changed temporarily. More likely it was all in his head, his brain still waking up after the operation. He froze. A thought had crossed his mind and refused to peacefully slip away like the others. Was it normal, he wondered with growing doubt, to have a general anaesthetic for the removal of a single mole? He hadn't even questioned it. The need to be put to sleep, to have all ability to protect himself robbed from him. They had all been so helpful, so friendly. He was gripped with rage. Of course they didn't need to put you to sleep to remove a mole. Mockingly benevolent hospital faces rose up in his mind, leering contemptuously at his vulnerable body. All the time they had been steering him into a position where they could do what they wanted to him, and like a bloody fool he had let them do it, let them knock him out for... how long? He might have been there for days, weeks, certainly for long enough for them to remove his penis and replace it with another. That didn't make sense, did it? Rationality took over again, and his anger instantly subsided. Why would anybody do that? He realised how idiotic he was letting himself be. There was a reason for the general anaesthetic. He could ask them. There would be an explanation. No, damn it, he didn't even need to know. Let them get on with being doctors and nurses. Let him get on with life and get out of here. With his penis. Nobody had replaced it. He'd been confused by the unusual light, the surroundings. That was all. The whole thing had been a product of his addled, recently awoken psyche. Relief flooded him in anticipation of looking at his penis and seeing that, like a nightmare, the alien phallus had departed with the light of full consciousness. He almost laughed out loud at the absurd panic he had felt only minutes ago. But reaching again for the gown, he found himself unable to move it, held by the dread of what he knew to be impossible. For a moment, he contemplated leaving it, closing his eyes, having a snooze, leaving the hospital without checking his bits, lest his brain play the same trick on him. But the not knowing would drive him mad. He took a deep breath and whipped the gown back. As soon as he looked, all of his false optimism drained away. In his alert state, he could no longer cling to hopeful doubts. All that was left was empty, relentless truth. It was not his penis. For whatever reason, somebody had given him a different one. And whoever had done it, he silently raged, was going to pay. He hauled himself out of bed and checked around it for his clothes. There was a small cabinet on wheels next to the bed, but it was empty and he could see no other storage space. Still he continued to look, reopening the bedside cabinet as if hoping that his clothes might, like a cheap magic trick, reveal themselves on the second or third check. Throughout his fruitless search, he told himself repeatedly how much he would sue the hospital for, and how he would see to it personally that everybody responsible had their dicks replaced. Frustrated by his failure to find his clothes, unable to contain his wrath for any longer, he threw back the curtains around the bed and stepped into the ward. Free from the claustrophobic certainty of the cubicle, faced with rows of beds and withered people, Jeff felt unsure and exposed. The hospital might as well have been deserted, the ward thick with the sickly, mortuary air of sleeping or dead patients. An old woman propped up in bed was moving her lips in her sleep like a rubbery animatronic puppet imitating human speech. Jeff began walking, treading silently so as not to wake the shells around him, trying to ignore the nauseating weight of the parasitic genitals hanging from his body. Empty hospital corridors were lit by sterile fluorescent lights, their continuous buzz the only thing breaking the desperate silence. Bland reproductions of famous paintings had been placed on the walls, an attempt to inject some life into the building, but instead it was the familiar works that lost their vibrancy, subjugated to the desolation pervading the awful place. The nearest reception was as deserted as the corridors. The intensity of his isolation growing every second, Jeff followed the signs to accident and emergency. That part of the hospital would be open, surely. And this was an emergency. Jeff found the waiting room in A&E cloaked with the gloomy timelessness that comes to places in the brief period before first light. A handful of people waited without expectation, dislocated from any sense of time and body. Yet the sight of other conscious human beings flooded Jeff with a kind of relief, accompanied by a confidence and a renewed anger at his treatment. He approached the reception desk purposefully. The receptionist looked up, a picture of disinterest, her indifferent expression as much a part of the listless surroundings as the furniture. "I don't suppose he began, his voice shaking with concentrated anger. "You know what has happened to my penis." The waiting patients turned to look at him, too long entrenched in the atmosphere of perpetual tedium to find the interruption entertaining or even surprising. A little girl, clutching a bloody tissue to her forehead, looked at Jeff with curious eyes. The woman next to her was tensed, as if ready to pull her daughter to safety if Jeff turned out to be as threatening as he looked. "Have you registered?" the receptionist expressionlessly inquired. "I don't need to register," snapped Jeff. "I'm here already." "Wait to be called," she said, barely looking at him. "You'll be assessed when it's your turn." Jeff noted that she had taken some time over her makeup. His irritation at the situation was immediately magnified by the fact that she had apparently paid more attention to her appearance than she was to the people she was employed to look after. "As you all note," he hissed, "if you actually bother to use your eyes, I am wearing a hospital gown, and if you have even half a working brain, you might conclude that I have not only been assessed, I have been admitted, and as it happens, I have also recently been operated on." "You need to go back to your own ward," the receptionist droned, not even the slightest change in her voice to suggest that she might have registered his sarcasm. "You'll be seen when it's your turn." "I'll be seen now," Jeff retorted. "I've woken up from an operation, and they've swiped my bloody penis." "Go back to your ward and you'll be seen as soon as it's your turn." "Are you listening to me?" yelled Jeff, slamming his hand down on the desk. "My penis has been stolen!" "Really?" She suddenly met his eyes, all at once coldly attentive. "Show me," she challenged. "Well," Jeff faltered, "they've put another one in its place." She said nothing to this, but very slightly raised an aggressively sculpted eyebrow. Jeff felt the blood rise to his face. How dare she? "I demand to see someone in charge," he demanded, feeling a flutter of humiliation at the petulant flavour his use of the word demand had given his demand. "Excuse me." The mother, with the little girl clutching the bloody tissue, was standing next to him. "We've been here for 3.5 hours. I wondered if you might be able to give us an update on waiting times." "Of course," said the receptionist, her voice sweetening. "No!" Jeff shouted. "I was here first! You can deal with me!" Every eye in the waiting room was fixed on him. The little girl's bloody tissue hovered in his peripheral vision. He experienced a momentary pang of guilt. No, he told himself angrily, he had rights. And this was his penis, for crying out loud. "I'm not going anywhere until you sort this out. I'm staying right here." He could feel the air of disapproval growing as the waiting patients started to stir. Their resignation was giving way to annoyance. Now arguing with the entire room, Jeff insisted with determined fury, "Look, it's my right! Is something the matter?" A nurse had halted in his pre-programmed path across the waiting room, animated by this unexpected glitch in the routine. "This bloke says he's lost his penis," the receptionist answered curtly. "Oh dear." The nurse didn't even bother to conceal his amusement. Jeff wanted to punch him. "When did you last see it?" "Before my operation." Jeff clenched his fists so hard he could feel his knuckles splitting through his skin. "I see," grinned the nurse. Jeff wanted to shake him, to yell in the nurse's face, "It's my penis, you grinning bastard! What's so bloody funny?" To bring his knee into sharp contact with the nurse's bollocks and see if everything was still so amusing then. "Could I, have a look?" "No, you don't understand." How many times did he have to explain? "They've put another one in its place. There's nothing to not see." "Oh." The nurse nodded. "So what's the problem then?" Jeff's blood pounded through his veins, thudding in his eardrums. "The problem is that it isn't my penis!" Everyone in the waiting room was now deeply engrossed in the proceedings, fully awakened from their trance-like depression and, in the guise of passive-aggressive displeasure, thankful for the entertainment. They tutted their disapproval as loudly as they dared, exchanged glances as if to say, "The way people behave," rolled their eyes and shook their heads. Jeff told himself again that he had no reason to feel guilty, that it wasn't his fault that he was being deliberately antagonized. "The penis you have now, it's not faulty in any way?" asked the nurse, as if inquiring about a photocopier. "That isn't the point!" "Perhaps you could tell me how yours differed from it." Gareth Ellis was enjoying the conversation. It was his 9th hour on the shift, and any break from the intense monotony of the night's work was a welcome one. But his enjoyment of the situation was not appreciated by Jeff. Nor was it shared by Roland Irvine, a retired acoustics consultant who had cut his hand open with a screwdriver whilst adjusting his bicycle brakes. He had been waiting to be seen by a doctor for 4 hours and 26 minutes, and he'd had enough. "Excuse me," he called across the waiting room, getting up out of his plastic chair and making his way towards them. "I've been waiting here for 6.5 hours to get my hand sewn up. I'm not in the mood to listen to this moron wasting everyone's time." Jeff swung round to confront him. "Excuse me, I couldn't care less about your sodding hand. I've had my— Yeah, I know, your penis has been nicked. I don't care if you've lost your entire fucking pelvis. You can wait in the queue like the rest of us." "That's enough," interrupted Gareth, all trace of his former amusement gone. Not only did he sense that what had at first been an amusing diversion might be about to blow up into a violent confrontation, but his parents had instilled in him a deep-seated hatred of bad language, and now that the F-word had been used, he was determined to end the discussion immediately. "Go and wait in your own ward. I'm not having you insulting other patients." "He insulted me," said Jeff, outraged. "Are you listening?" Gareth's goodwill, worn thin by lack of sleep, had run out. "Either get back to your bed, where we'll see you shortly, or leave now." "I want to see somebody in charge," Jeff demanded again. "If he doesn't sod off, I'll be the one asking to see somebody in charge," whined Roland. "I have every right—" "Shut up, both of you!" barked Gareth. He was shocked and upset by his own vehemence. He hated shouting. He didn't get angry. "Listen!" Jeff bellowed. "No!" Gareth bellowed back, tears pricking the back of his eyes. "I'm leaving," said Jeff impulsively. He was incensed by the audible sigh of relief from the waiting patients. "But you haven't heard the last of this!" He looked around for a response, but already nobody was listening. Only as he strode furiously outside did he realise that he was still wearing a hospital gown. All his clothes were still somewhere inside the building. And his phone. And his wallet. And his penis. In a moment of clarity, he realised what a ridiculous situation he was in. Standing outside at some godforsaken hour in the morning, barefoot and wearing a skimpy hospital gown, the sensible thing was to turn around and go back inside, back to his bed. Surely he would have a chance of recovering at least some of his bits in the morning. But Jeff Clayton was a proud man, and, having paused to consider it, he knew that going back inside was not an option. He couldn't bear the thought of the smug looks the other patients would give him as he shuffled back through those doors with his tail between his legs, or of the wearied scorn of that heavily made-up receptionist and that effeminate doctor, of the smell of ill people. He had committed to his dramatic exit, and he was going to have to see it through. Thank God he'd had the foresight to install a key safe in his back garden. A taxi pulled up outside the entrance. Jeff hurried towards it. An old man was helping a decrepit, confused old woman to struggle out. Jeff waited and despised them for being old and slow and in his way. The man glanced at him suspiciously as they walked towards the entrance, and Jeff felt ridiculed by the knowledge that, slow and decrepit as he was, that old man was almost certainly in possession of his own penis. As the hospital grew smaller in the window behind him, Jeff experienced a sickening wrench in his stomach. His penis was in that building, and every second took him further away from it. "Had a good evening," the taxi driver called into the back of the car. Jeff's first instinct was to subject him to a barrage of abuse, but given the situation, it seemed sensible to keep him on side. He waited until he could trust himself to speak, before pointing out that the location at which he had been picked up hardly intimated that a good evening had been had. "Oh, well," the driver said with a sniff, "you're in better shape than the ones I drive in the other direction." "I'm sure that's how it looks," Jeff replied bitterly. In the rearview mirror he could see an almost imperceptible scar on his face where the mole had been. It should have pleased him, but it now represented a greater loss. He felt a sudden need to unburden himself. "You know what happened?" he told the taxi driver. "I woke up after the operation, and they'd given me somebody else's penis." "Mate, the number of people who come out of there and tell me that," said the taxi driver, shaking his head sympathetically. This offhand response threw Jeff. "Really? Oh, for sure. They're always cutting off the wrong thing, amputating the wrong arm, circumcising the wrong baby. You know what I reckon? They're so up against it, right, with the state of the hospitals and underfunding and so on, that they don't know who's in for what, so they do everything on everyone to be on the safe side. My aunt went into hospital for an x-ray. She had a lung thing, see? When she came out, they'd replaced both her hips and enlarged her breasts as well. Oh dear, said Jeff, simultaneously unconvinced and resentful of his own problem being unjustly marginalised by those of the driver's aunt. Not that she was complaining, bloody delighted on both counts, in fact. We made sure she got a small fortune in compensation all the same. You did? This was of more interest, even if the aunt was hypothetical. Well, you've got to take advantage when it's their mistake, haven't you? How do you go about that exactly? Jeff asked. My sister, continued the driver, ignoring the question, they took out her liver by mistake. Or was it a kidney? Whichever it was, when she complained, they gave her 2 new ones to make up for the inconvenience. Jeff's first action was to inform the police. What time did the theft occur? Inquired the regional-sounding officer on the telephone. While I was under general anaesthetic, Jeff impatiently explained. It could have been any time after about 5 o'clock. You can't be any more specific? No, I was unconscious. I see. The officer clicked her teeth softly. Jeff imagined her logging the details in a big book at the police station, then thought to himself that they probably had a computer, and was wondering why his frame of reference for police stations was entirely based on period dramas, when the officer spoke again. Was there anything identifying it as yours? Identifying it? Repeated Jeff. What did they want? A tattoo? Any distinguishing features? It was a penis, for God's sake, exploded Jeff. Don't you know what a penis looks like? They're standard questions, sir, she politely informed him. The more information we have about stolen items, the more easily we can return them to their owners. How many stolen penises are you looking for? Jeff retorted. Not many, admitted the officer. There was another thoughtful silence. Then, you'll receive a crime number by email, and you ought to drop by the police station in about 3 weeks' time to check whether anybody has handed in your item. Wait, Jeff's ears were almost bleeding with rage. I've reported a theft to you, the police, and you're telling me that I've got to come and check if you've recovered my item, just to be on the safe side. We get a lot of things handed in, so they do slip through the net, smaller items in particular. I know that you're assuming it's small, Jeff angrily remarked. Then what size are we talking exactly? She inquired. That's the kind of information that could be extremely useful in identifying it as yours. Jeff hung up. He arranged to meet up with his old university friend Pete Franklin, who had been an almost successful concert pianist before switching careers and becoming a lawyer. They gave you a different penis? God, this is a bloody awful state of things, isn't it? Pete said sympathetically, shaking his head. I thought you might be able to give me some legal advice, Jeff said. Yeah, right, yeah, agreed Pete, sipping at his gin and tonic. He frowned. I don't think this is a double. Does this taste like a double to you? I ordered a double. Jeff tasted it and agreed that it didn't entirely taste like a double. Fuck's sake, cursed Pete, getting up. This is the fucking awful state of things. When he returned with his drink, Pete explained that Jeff was in a difficult legal situation. If they'd taken your penis altogether, you'd have a much easier case. There'd be something to show the court. Or rather, nothing to show the court, if you get my... since they replaced it with another one, there's not a tangible absence, is there? He shook his head again. I'm not saying you would lose, but where's your evidence? They'd assume you were trying it on. Trying it on? Jeff echoed. Why would I do that? Why does anybody do anything? You'd be amazed some of the clients I take on. Pretending a penis has been swapped is small fry. Jeff clenched his teeth. I'm not pretending. Oh, I know that, Pete hurriedly reassured him. But it's not me you have to convince, is it? It's a cynical judge, probably with private healthcare, no idea what goes on in the real world. The odds are stacked against you. So, what, there's nothing I can do? Jeff concluded, miserably. Look, Pete put a hand on his arm supportively. You know how many injustices there are in this country every day? Every hour. I see them all the time, all around me. He laughed. I'm often on the side that's perpetuating them, you know? "But this is a scandal," Jeff hissed. "We brush scandals under the carpet all the time," Pete told him. "I'm not saying it's fair, that's just how it is, and nobody cares. Everybody knows, nobody cares. Except when there's a fucking prestige drama made about it. Then they care. But the rest of the time, not so much." "I need to get someone to make a prestige drama about me, that's what you're saying?" "Oh," Pete sipped his now acceptable gin and tonic. "Your story isn't really prestige drama, is it? It's one of those late-night documentaries or, I don't know, a sitcom." "I'm yet to see the funny side," Jeff tersely informed him. Convinced that he had an insufficiently persuasive legal case to make, but determined not to let the matter drop, Jeff decided that the way to gain some attention, and hopefully some financial remuneration, would be to engage the interest of the press. The broadsheets rejected his story out of hand. The tabloids also decided it was too preposterous for their pages, except for one which fleetingly considered running the story until the editor pointed out that only 2 weeks ago they had given much coverage to a man who had trapped his penis in a microwave. The stories were felt to be too similar for Jeff's to be of use. Losing hope, Jeff began to wonder if he needed to settle for the penis he had. For days he had refused to look at it, even to touch it. Visits to the toilet were handled with a lot of squinting and guesswork, and he took a not dissimilar spray-and-pray approach to washing himself. He had to admit that it wasn't a sustainable situation. Then Mary Collingwood came to the rescue. Mary was another of his contemporaries at university. In fact, she had dated Pete for a year or so, which was the main reason Jeff had ever spent time with her. He himself found her nauseatingly driven and self-motivated. A classic last-minute crammer, the last thing Jeff wanted was someone in his social life reminding him how little he had achieved every day. When she crashed back into his life, little seemed to have changed. "Pete gave me your number," she told him, sounding indecently cheery for someone calling first thing on a Saturday. "I hope you don't mind." "You're still in touch with Pete?" She laughed. "We dated for a year, Jeff. Surely you're still in touch with a few of your former flames, if only to make sure they know what a mistake they made letting you go." "The opposite, really," Jeff mumbled, conscious that none of his former flames had ever shown the slightest potential for regret. "He told me about your little problem," she continued. "Why do people keep assuming it's little?" Jeff protested. "He thought I might be able to help. A while ago I co-founded an organisation facilitating access to justice, ensuring that individuals have their human rights looked out for, that sort of thing." "Of course you did." "It's gained a fair bit of traction, been quite a success." "Of course it has." "Well, it sounds as though you found out how the system can work against the individual, and Pete thought we might be able to help." Jeff sighed. "How exactly?" he asked. "Can you get me compensation?" "It's not quite that simple," Mary said, maintaining the same revoltingly cheerful tone. "I mean, maybe, eventually, over a matter of years, once we've built up a picture. It's the building up a picture part we're interested in. You see, we can put the information out on our network, and it gives people an opening to tell their own stories. We're able to start to identify systemic patterns of mismanagement and corruption. You'd be helping other people." "Oh, great," sneered Jeff. "What I really wanted out of this whole situation was a chance to help people." "I knew you'd be on board," said Mary, clearly as unable to detect sarcasm as she had been at university, another of the reasons her company had been so unbearable. "The first thing to do is get all the facts down as we know them and create a case study. Then we'll put out a press release. Drawing people's attention to injustice is a major aspect of our success." "Well, on that front you won't have any success," Jeff said, finding some ironic pleasure in being able to deflate her balloon of optimism. "I've already approached the press, and they're not interested." "Leave it with me," she said, and he could feel the heat of her insufferable beam down the phone line. "It's often about how you tell the story." It turned out to be very much about how you tell the story. It first appeared on page 5 of the Daily Excess under the headline "Post-op Cockshock," which, as Jeff grumbled to everyone who mentioned it to him, didn't even rhyme. "The headline is unfortunate," Mary admitted when she phoned to discuss their next move. "We don't really have any say on how newspapers present stories, least of all when they're tabloids." But it made the whole thing seem like a joke, Jeff whined. We do see that happen as well, Mary admitted. That's just the way newspapers are, but at least the story's out there. It's a start, Jeff. The story was out there, and when some slightly more respectable journalists did some digging and discovered, thanks in no small part to the comprehensive case study on foundationsforjustice.org, that it was true, it began to appear inside some more respectable newspapers, reported in a way that did not make it seem like a joke. Then a couple of journalists got in touch via Mary. Jeff was able to tell the story in his own words, and at last it began to be reported in a way that acknowledged the deep, personal trauma of the situation. Things heated up even more when a disgruntled, albeit anonymous, source, said to come from the very heart of the health service, approached Foundations for Justice with what was claimed to be hard proof, pun fully exploited by several tabloids, of some 30 or so similar cases. When the papers picked up on anecdotal evidence that it was happening on an even more widespread basis, there was an outcry. Suddenly, Jeff's story was not only being reported as serious news, but as serious front-page news. It was a national scandal which affected everyone, and everyone was very angry indeed. There were allegations and denials. There were resignations. The government promised an immediate inquiry into the situation, and then spent several weeks having to explain why the inquiry had not in fact started immediately, and eventually denied having promised an inquiry in the first place, which itself led to more resignations, though not, obviously, of the people who had promised the inquiry. Jeff, meanwhile, was featured in magazines and on chat shows. He got to tell his story again, but in a more glamorous context, to sympathetically outraged presenters, who were equally interested in his choice of wallpaper and favourite meal. He became quite a familiar face on daytime television, was routinely consulted by radio programmes about the day's news stories, and eventually became a bit of a minor celebrity. He even did a couple of naked photo shoots, tasteful ones, of course, but even so, something he would never have contemplated in the past. But now, well, it was somebody else's penis, wasn't it? So he didn't really see any reason to feel embarrassed about displaying it. So, although he wasn't exactly glad that it had happened to him, he found he wasn't entirely sorry either. He was certainly making the most of a bad situation. In the meantime, he was learning to live with the offending limb. He no longer felt strange about touching it, or about engaging its employment in any of the things for which it was designed. Indeed, in terms of that thing, the one that was a less routine activity, or at least had been previously, he found that he was getting a great deal of use out of it. Women seemed intrigued by it. They had heard all about it and wanted to see it and touch it, and, well, pretty much anything else they could think of to do with it, and he certainly wasn't going to stop them. "Does it feel different?" they would ask, to how it did before, being, somebody else's. As if they thought that because it was somebody else's penis, it would be somebody else getting pleasure from their attentions. He would admit that, no, it felt pretty much the same, and they usually looked disappointed at that, but why on earth they imagined he would let them do what they were doing if he wasn't getting the benefit, he had no idea. Anyway, once their curiosity had been sated, he generally didn't see them again, or if he did, it was awkward, but that didn't matter because he had been pretty awkward with women before this whole thing, and there always seemed to be somebody else with curiosity to satisfy. After a while, other people started to come forward with stories of their own. This was a source of great delight to Mary. "It's working," she said to Jeff in one of her regular phone calls. "Didn't I say you'd be giving other people an opening to tell their stories?" The scandal grew, and the imminent government inquiry necessarily became even more imminent, whilst, paradoxically, not actually getting any closer because every new revelation made the terms of the inquiry more complicated to define. There was a man who claimed that he had left hospital with somebody else's right knee, and a woman who said that since leaving hospital with a different person's hands, she had been completely unable to play the piano. The piano-playing bit turned out to be demonstrably true, but rather less dramatic, given that the woman in question had not been able to play it in the first place. There were multiple people with new fingers and toes, an elderly couple who said that their noses had been swapped, and a family who said that their entire 10-year-old son had been replaced with an identical-looking but very slightly grumpier child. Jeff, having become a go-to vox pop on all contemporary affairs, was a natural port of call for all media seeking opinions on these stories. He tried to sound concerned and to offer helpful advice about coping with the trauma, but in all honesty he was not that interested in these other grievances, some of which did not even sound that plausible. Besides which, he felt that they were distracting from his own plight. Of course, he found himself saying, what we really need to do, as well as ensure that this sort of thing never happens again, is to reunite people with their original body parts. I myself, for example. People started to say nasty things about him. Not to his face, but accounts on social media, or the kind of people who leave comments underneath online articles. Jeff Clayton is only interested in himself, they said, or have you noticed how Jeff Clayton always tries to make the story about his own penis? Or Jeff Clayton is always on the radio, he's just doing it for attention. One day he was giving his view on the tea time television news about a lady who had come out of hospital with a different person's lower left thigh and, having said the usual thing about how it was scandalous that this was still happening in civilized society and that certain people needed to be brought to account, he added, with an ill-advised laugh, I suppose it's lucky in a way that it was only her lower left thigh, at which the presenter asked him, are you suggesting that it's less traumatic to end up with somebody else's lower left thigh than it is to end up with somebody else's penis? And he responded, well, yes. This turned out to be a mistake. The nasty comments got nastier. People started saying rude things to him in the street. His friends stopped talking to him. The idea that he was doing it all for attention was joined by the increasingly frequent suggestion that he never really found himself with a different penis in the first place. Did you just make it up? Said a co-worker with whom a few weeks earlier he had, probably unwisely, spent the night. Did you say it so that I'd be interested in it? He responded with a staunch denial, of course, but it didn't stop her telling everyone that he had tricked her into a moment of intimacy that was clearly inappropriate for a work colleague. He was asked to take a few days off while they sorted it out. The next story he was asked to comment on was about a teenage boy who claimed his entire right side had been replaced with somebody else's during a trip to the dentist. It was a phone interview with a current affairs radio programme, and he was so used to these interviews by now that he hadn't bothered finding out anything about the story. And in his defence, he was feeling a bit stressed about the whole work situation. But when he heard the full story live on air, he lost his temper and said, for goodness sake, if he's had his entire right-hand side replaced, who's to say which is the original side? Why would we assume the right-hand side is the interloper when it has to put up with a new left-hand side? Perhaps the two sides just need to learn to share. This turned out to be a mistake. The Jeff Clayton doesn't care about anyone else type comments ramped up considerably. People started throwing rotten eggs at his house, and on one or two occasions, straight at him. Women no longer seemed interested in his new penis, or indeed in Jeff. He was told by his superiors at work that he was on indefinite unpaid leave pending an investigation into his behaviour. He hoped that the investigation would show how unfairly he had been treated, and maybe then women would be interested in him again, or at least in his new penis. But it seemed to be taking a while for them to start the investigation, rather like the government inquiry. He had never been very interested in social media, but with so much time on his hands he signed up to a few websites so that he could argue with the people who were calling him selfish. For some reason, this only seemed to confirm their poor view of him. If you're not doing it for attention, then how come you're here looking up what people are saying about you? Is the sort of thing they said. He would type careful, measured responses to critical opinions, trying to undo the damage his last media appearance had caused. I'm not in it for myself, he would say. I want to undo the harm that has been caused towards many hundreds of people in the same situation as me. Then comments would come back like, if you're so concerned about the situation, why aren't you campaigning for change instead of wasting your time here? And these words were always accompanied by symbols or little pictures that were sarcastic or crude. and although he didn't really understand them, this was, absurdly, the thing he found most hurtful of all. Mary phoned. "We've decided to drop your case study from the website," she apologetically informed him. "Obviously, you've been a great help to us. It's thanks to you we have so many other case studies to talk about. But I'm afraid an association with you is not really considered helpful at the present time." "OK," said Jeff. "Well, maybe I can catch up with you and Pete at some point. Buy you a drink to thank you for everything you've done?" "Maybe," agreed Mary, and that was the last he heard from her. Since the incident on the radio, he hadn't been asked to do any more interviews. There were other people with more glamorous replacement body parts to ask now. The old lady with the young man's chin was the favourite with daytime television viewers, and the half-and-half teenager had started a hugely successful video channel on which his left-hand side held conversations about clothes and pop music with his right-hand side. Still, people kept coming forward with their stories of dreadful replacements. The scandal continued. The newspapers were all running special series following the story, and it was suggested that there might be many thousands of people affected who didn't even realise it. Then a man made the headlines when he declared that he had been in treatment for 3 weeks with breathing difficulties, and on emerging from hospital his breathing was better, but absolutely no body parts had been replaced. He listed the parts of his body that he believed needed replacing and expressed his disgust that a service clearly available to the elite was not afforded to ordinary buggers like me. A whole new cycle of news stories began about the people scandalously unaffected by the scandal. The government renewed its commitment to an inquiry at the earliest possible opportunity. Jeff's workplace quietly decided that he should take voluntary redundancy, and he was too weary to argue. But at least the nasty comments seemed to have levelled out a bit, and a few of the people he spoke to on the different social media websites were unexpectedly sympathetic. There were even a couple of women who took an interest, not in him so much as the part of him that had been replaced, but still, it was better than nothing. One day his phone rang, and it was the director of the hospital where he'd had his operation. "I'm phoning personally because I have to let you know that we have located your penis." Jeff didn't say anything. He almost didn't understand what he was hearing. "Well," she continued, sounding a little put out by his silence, "I must offer an unreserved apology. It turns out that this was entirely our mistake, an administrative error that should never have happened and which will never happen again. But the good news is that we can offer the operation to reattach your own penis at the earliest convenience." The news began to sink in. After all this time, it had been over 6 months, he would have his own penis back. The nightmare was over. The name-calling, the egg-throwing. It would all stop, and things would go back to normal. Perhaps there wouldn't be any women interested in seeing his original penis, but maybe there might be. It had quite a story to tell, after all. He took his clothes off and stood in front of his full-length mirror. The funny thing was that he didn't mind it at all now. He had grown used to it. But it wasn't his, was it? It was like going on holiday. However nice the place you've been, it's always a bit of a relief to get home. The appointment was booked with remarkable speed and efficiency. There were a couple of consultations, a few tests, but within the fortnight he was due in the hospital for the full operation. It warranted a mention on the inside pages of a couple of newspapers, but by now there were far more spectacular stories in the public arena, and few people were all that interested in Jeff Clayton. The day before the operation, he had a final consultation with the surgeon, a well-spoken young man who was glowing with genuine pleasure at the forthcoming procedure. "There will be the slightest scar," he explained, "which I can guarantee will be entirely imperceptible, even to anyone who happens to take an extremely close look, should that ever—" Jeff nodded. "It'll be a general anaesthetic, of course, and when you wake up you'll be your old self again, that's simple." Then he pushed a sturdy plastic box across the shiny oak desk and removed the lid. "This fellow should be familiar, hey?" Jeff stared. The thing sitting inside the box resembled nothing so much as a congealed cocktail sausage, left over at the end of a school disco. "Soon have you properly reacquainted, what?" "There's been a mistake." Jeff stood up, looking away from the thing in the box. "Sorry, that's not mine." "What?" "It's not mine. You've found the wrong penis." The surgeon grinned reassuringly. "It's been a while, I understand. But believe me, there's no doubt as to whose it is." He chuckled. "We don't just have these lying around all over the place, I can assure you." "But it—" Jeff stared at it again. Was it his? It looked so small and unimpressive. "It doesn't look like mine." "We did a DNA test. I promise it has all been confirmed. That's yours." "It looks strange." The surgeon laughed again. "You can't blame us for that." Jeff backed away. "No." The surgeon looked at him quizzically. "No?" "I don't want it." The surgeon stared, the meaning of this visibly dawning on his face. Then the surgeon swallowed. "You realise," he said quietly, "that this is bound to get out. It's not such a huge story, you being reunited with it, but if you turn it down, well." Jeff considered the meaning of this well. Certainly it would be awkward. He had continually said that all he wanted was his original penis back. If it were known that he had turned it down, it would be a free-for-all for everyone who claimed he was motivated by anything but that. He would be called an attention seeker, a time-waster, a fraud. Having said that, at least they would be talking about him. If he went through with the operation, he would be, as the surgeon said, his old self again. And Jeff Clayton, with his original penis, had never been of much interest to anyone. He looked back at the thing in the box and made his decision. "Chuck it," he said. You have been listening to Neurotic Literature, written and performed by me, James Lark. I wrote and performed it, expecting absolutely nothing in return, but if you feel like exceeding my low expectations, you can spread the word about this podcast by telling people about it, or leaving a review on your podcast platform of choice, or you can even make a financial donation at ko-fi.com, that's ko-fi.com/neurotic literature. I know, paying money for a podcast, it feels strange and wrong. I'm literally just following advice I was given by a contented listener. Well, I assume it was a contented listener, but I guess I'm assuming that it was advice and not a sarcastic joke, which, now that I think about it, seems equally plausible.